Hello, everyone. Hi, Lívia. Can you hear me, please? Yes? Smile. It's good that you smile. Okay, I'd like to welcome my dear friends, okay? Achim Steiner, Maria Netto, and Roberto Jaguaribe, and also another one that are here in the room, in Casa Copy. Casa Copy, it's a partnership between CEBRI and ICS, Instituto Clima e Sociedade. It's a really informal place to powerful dialogues, okay? And I'd like, first of all, to thank you very much for all of you to join us today, particularly because my friend Achim Steiner took a decision to come to Brazil, to go to Brasilia. This is a high-risk task, okay? And but of course, that based on his experience, he's a Brazilian guy. Okay, he was born in Brazil. He's a gaúcho. Nobody's perfect, believe me. But we asked, is it possible that you can stay here for this afternoon before flying to Brasilia? You have to in Brasilia a seminar that I will join you tomorrow. But to such in a way that you can explore what you are doing now after your experience in United Nations as UNEP and also UNDP. Yes, you can do this, and the idea here that you can have informal dialogue based on not only his experience, but also in his vision in this momentum of the world, how you should come with some issues that particularly are strategic for the debate of international cooperation, and also how to have less vulnerable societies consider the threats that we have today around the world, and how indeed you should come to provoke new visions, a new ways to approach issues like security, defense, vulnerabilities, resilience, adaptation, have different ways. It's not only based on climate change. This is very important. We are discussing development, we are discussing how the new geographies of the world, the new cartography, the political cartography of the world, the new territories, not only the physical ones, okay? You have cyberspace, you have different perspectives in the world, and indeed how a friend, he's a friend of Brazil, and that we used to come together since Rio +20, Rio's Sustainable Development Goals, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, etc., how indeed you should frame things in different ways. It's very important to understand in an age of interconnected crisis, how people could be interconnected. The other side, it's very important when you go to discuss security, defense, that is not only today, in this age, this moment of the world, that we are coming on with military approach or military constituents. And also how this is coming to democracy, how the Western countries are coming to debate it or not, and the challenge that a country like Brazil and middle power countries could come into this agenda and to explore the new ways to express our soft power, for example, but our understanding also potential leadership in the new context of the world. I'm very happy to meet my friend. We're a really close friend. Today is in Oxford. I'd like to ask you to have a brief presentation about what we're doing today and the challenges. I'm proposing that you can come closer, Clarissa, to have a partnership between CEBRI, Roberto, and Oxford University. Achim is also the chair of a Hamburger conference that is very important that you show us what will be there, okay? And what we're proposing, because we have Munich conference and we have a new conference coming with a new perspective, a new way to bring things together. What is fascinating for me particularly is because Achim is a guy that is not playing based on the past. And this is a big challenge because we are comfortable in the past. We have our idea in the past because we know who you are in the past. Not necessarily know, Roberto, how you play the future. In this disruptive moment of the world, we used to frame, to navigate international cooperation, international system, etc., with the conditions that were established that everything is over. I used to say that the importance of multilateral systems, but they used to be the broken system today. The role of institutions, how the institutions are melting down today, how indeed they should consider Western values. I particularly have difficulty with the global South and global North. I prefer to understand the Western and non-Western countries, but this is the new dynamics to bring things together. Of course, that when you go into climate age and climate security or climate vulnerability, this is part of the equation of vulnerability or less vulnerable society, but it's not the one issue. When you go into nature to provide solutions, for example, for climate crisis and also for hard power, we cannot go into electrification, we cannot go into the new weapons without discussing minerals, without discussing resource, without discussing nature. What's the role of nature as political player? I'm not discussing here biodiversity, okay? I'm not discussing the environmental constituency. We need to move beyond this, okay, if you want to come into the real world of this century. Finally, it's very important to observe that this is a century and the new millennium based on Christ. The last 25 years, we're exposed to Christ. If you check the timetable, check the timeline, it's impressive. Since the 2001, okay, remember the old one, Aspaz is here, that not the old because you're an old woman, because a part of the past. That the last decade of the last century was fully dedicated for multilateral system to provide a new vision to the world based on sustainability, on democracy. Remember that we're restoring democracy in the Western country, and you have 2011, September 11 is so disruptive in this moment of the world. And the things change. It keeps changing, in my understanding. Sometimes you have, also in my understanding, that we insist to have the passing movement. Okay, and we need to tackle the present to understand the future. Nobody knows what it means. And we need to be prepared to open the political rooms for the new generations, because you're not able to propose things to play the same roles that we used to play in the past. It's a huge mistake in my understanding. Maria Netto is the head of ICS, Instituto Clima Sociedade. We're an important partner, the most important sponsor and partner considered the climate and environmental unit of CEBRI. And we have Lívia Pagotto. Unfortunately, she is in São Paulo. She's not able to join us in person. She's a new partner of Instituto Arapyaú. What it means that we're coming to discuss the role of philanthropy in the context of the country like Brazil, our relevance in the world or not, consider some issues. And of course, to understand, that's why my friend, Ambassador Roberto Jaguaribe, is here to discuss this vision that we have today with the crisis, the different crises, interconnected crises that around the world, and also the role, if the diplomacy, the business as usual, the old traditional way to approach things is enough to come to promote Brazil with its relevance and this also our capacities to move forward, to consider development, and also nature as a political player. I used to say that nature is a political player. And nature means biodiversity plus resource, minerals, critical minerals, materials, new materials. We cannot move forward, for example, in defense with new weapons, with hard power, without understanding the role of critical minerals, land, water, etc., etc. And I don't believe that we will be able to build our process based on threats and based on vulnerabilities. We need to find ways to come together, to have alliance, to have partners, to understand how the new international cooperation will be framed in transition, okay, in a multipolar world, probably, okay, where the broken system, the multilateral system, is melting down, but is still playing important roles, some debates. But the global perspectives, considering climate change, public health, trade, innovation, also trade innovation, and also, let's see, democracy for the political system, is very important to be highlighted if we're able to manage things or not. We cannot forget, when you come in our constituents to discuss the triple environmental crisis, that at the same time we have the triple political crisis. The populism, the lack of trust, the fake news, the misinformation of the world. This is the political crisis that we know into democracy. We cannot forget that the difficulties that the countries have today to move forward, for example, to finance lifestyles, for example, what's happening in European, and after the NATO demands for investment for the United States, what is happening in the finance in Europe, and how countries like Germany is coming to provide security in the traditional way, but not necessarily other countries have the same alliance, the same alignment to understand the costs of defense and vulnerability and security. So the way to discuss security, the way to frame things, I think that is one of the critical issues that Achim is coming to provoke us. So I would like to thank you very much to be here today. It was a pleasure to have our carioca lunch. We went to Guimas, of course. Okay, we have our caipirinha together and our picadinho, and we really reshaped the world. It's true. Okay, we reshaped. You are not there, Maria. Next time you'll be there. But you know, everyone that knows me know that Guimas is a password, okay, to change things. So we were there, our business as usual tradition. Remember our meetings in Botanical Garden, etc., and understanding that our generation, we still have a really important role to provoke the world and provoke all the people to make sure that this country, as a middle power country, I don't know, Roberto, if you agree with this, you have really could have innovative role that is not based on green wishing, or not based on tackle deforestation. Okay. Finally, I provoke him about transnational perspectives. This is a big challenge. And you have organized crime as part of this. And organized crime, when I had to manage this as a minister, it was during the kindergarten of my life. Today, what's happening the way it's really threatened, okay? And how the countries are coming, international cooperation, to manage this, to understand this. So these are good examples how, indeed, the debate about security and defense and also vulnerability, be less vulnerable, not necessarily means be resilient. Okay, you need to understand how the countries and how the national security, the national reality will be so strategic to affirm the new roles and responsibilities of countries around the world. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. You have here in person around 45 people that join us. At the internet, we have 100 people online. The idea is that I can invite you, Achim, to introduce yourself, to say how happy you are to meet me, okay? And my friend. And, well, look, we're together. You discussed Sustainable Development Goals. Now we proposed this. Okay, nobody knows this. Okay, Brazil proposed together with UNDP the first version of Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, and another thing. So discuss green economy is better today than discuss ecological economy, for example. It's very funny how the world in less than 10 years or 15 years, everything changed. So this guy knows a lot about not only multilateral systems, but know a lot about cooperation, international cooperation. As a Brazilian guy, okay, he's a Brazilian. He drinks caipirinha, okay, and he really understands very well our role as a merchant economy, and also these new like-minded blocks, and how Brazil, Clarissa, is a powerful country to play in the energy security agenda based on the fossil fuels, and also based on the renewable, the challenge of emerging technology that will impact this framework. So we need to discuss things based on the present and understand very well what is the ambition to manage the trade-offs in the present. So vulnerability, risks, defense, etc., will play a really important role in my understanding, and I agree with some assumptions of Steiner, but our intention here is to host all of you every time that you have a good friend that comes to Brazil, okay, that you can host here in Casa Copy in CEBRI, and coming with the new programs and new challenges that we will do together. Finally, yes, we are proposing together with Instituto Clínico Sociedade the second year of Brazil Day. It's more than Brazil Day, Roberto? You know that I simplify things, but I don't like to simplify things. Probably 2 days or 3 days, I'm not sure yet, in London Climate Week in June, okay? And I invite him to set a round table in Chatham House together with us to discuss security, defense, vulnerabilities, the new world, and how we come as a preparation process also by the end of June that we join him in Hamburger conference. So it's what it is. We are coming together to discuss, to bring people together, to bring brains, okay, and to avoid the privilege of ignorance that unfortunately you have today around the world. So welcome to CEBRI, Casa Copy. Welcome, my dear friend. I'm so happy tomorrow to meet you. But the idea is that let's you have the opening remarks with his speech. After this, I'll invite Maria Netto and invite Lívia Pagotto to add some comments based on your experience, your view, and critics. Put pressure on this guy, okay, Maria? And after, you invite you and Roberto to come to analyze things and bring new perspectives of the debate. I think that here is how the brains are together think about challenges, and not to be affirmative, to provoke the debate, to provoke the conversation, to provoke the dialogue, okay, to be creative enough to make sure that a country like Brazil will have relevance not only in the future, but today. And I think that we need to reframe a lot of things. So, my dear friends, Lívia, thank you very much for joining us, okay? And I'd like to give you the floor, okay? And be happy, enjoy, and I'm so happy that you're here.
I thought you were going to say behave. No, Izabella, thank you first of all for, on behalf of also CEBRI and all of you who have come together here this afternoon to give me an opportunity. I wasn't thinking of provoking, but maybe it's not a bad term to use, because in a group like we are perhaps here and online today, I imagine that we share quite a number of shared outlooks, perspectives, observations on what is happening in the world. Where it gets more difficult is how do you respond to that? So thank you again for also being on the panel here, and Lívia as well. I perhaps begin briefly, Izabella, to say after many years of working internationally, I was once the head of an institution called the World Commission on Dams. Almost ruined my career, because dams are almost like religion, an act of faith, and you get very emotional and passionate about it, including here in Brazil. When we held a consultation in São Paulo, and the helicopters were circling above because the Movimento Sem Terra had come to the consultation. But it went remarkably well and peaceful, because we had a very frank dialogue. And one of the reasons that I think we are all struggling with what's happening in the world today is that we are rapidly losing the ability to have frank dialogues with one another. I then went on to serve as Director General of IUCN. I later was elected Executive Director of UNEP, and the last 8 years I spent as the head of UNDP in New York. And in a sense, much of my life, which, as Izabella said, began in the beautiful state of Rio Grande do Sul, I just want to put that on record, in a small town called Carazinho, and led me in the end to spend a few years of my life working in this sometimes very remote arena of multilateralism. I never had planned to be there. Many coincidences, as with all of us, lead us into these positions. And as I left New York last July after my 2 terms, I reflected a lot on what do we do in this moment in time. We could see already the phenomena of Trump too, but we could also see what had happened with Russia and Ukraine. We could see the war in Sudan. We could see what was happening in Gaza, in Israel, and I could go on with conflicts, India and Pakistan suddenly, Cambodia and Thailand. I mean, it was almost like a nightmare. Wherever you looked, people thought they somehow had to begin to fight with each other. And what also, I think, became increasingly clear to me is that we had lost both confidence in many of the institutions and assumptions that perhaps in 1945, 46, 47, when the Charter of the United Nations was written, when multilateralism was invented, when the aspirations really drove the expectations, we seem to have lost that confidence, and some would argue the trust also. So in many of our societies today, there is a deep sense of insecurity. There is an increasing fear about the future, and particularly with younger people in many parts of the world, not everywhere, but in many parts of the world, a kind of almost sense of resignation that these things that are happening out there are beyond my control. And with the advent of digital and social media and social networks, we have also seen an extraordinary ability to somehow escape, not from reality, but escape from the daily reality of having to be part of a, let's say, societally consequential set of interactions, to one that is happening in a virtual sphere. So many of our young people, I don't think, have lost their interest or spirit in being engaged. They just don't find easily issues, causes, movements in which to engage with a sense of hope. Because much of our political narrative, much of our daily news narrative, much of our security narrative, environmental narrative, economic narrative is essentially pretty hopeless at the moment. We are deprived of that sense that perhaps when many of us were younger drove us. It was that sense of opportunity, of possibility, of hope. If you look at what is being communicated today, It is a great deal about what is going wrong, that the future is dark, and in fact it is amplified, as we are seeing increasingly, by the algorithms that thrive as a business model on dividing societies. We live in an age of technologically driven polarization, not just political issues, but actually technologically driven. It pays to divide, it pays to hate, and it pays to give a platform to those who play out their worst fantasies on that platform. So I begin with this sort of context because I think in the way that we can look, as Izabella said, not just in the rearview mirror and look at history and say, okay, this is what history teaches us. People are very capable of transacting lessons from history, but what they're actually living through right now is the present, and the present is deeply disturbing. It is deeply disruptive. It is deeply alienating and polarizing, and it is increasingly driven by a sense that an order, however you would describe that order, whether a post-Second World War order, a multilateral order, the international rule of law, I mean, we can use many different terms, is crumbling before our very eyes. I then took that notion of security very much as a prism through which to, first of all, begin to understand how do we reframe the way we think about the future. If we are unable to imagine and think and articulate a vision of the future, then we are trapped in the present. It's a bit like flying through a thunderstorm. If you don't have a compass and you don't know how to get through and where you want to come out of that thunderstorm, you are completely consumed by that thunderstorm. And I believe we are drifting into a moment like this. Roberto and I spoke just before I came in, and I recounted to him also my experiences at the Munich Security Conference. Obviously one of the premier meetings on the annual calendar, where perhaps in the last 10 years, an increasingly sophisticated and diverse sense of security was beginning to be articulated. But frankly, what I saw this February in Munich is a Europe, in a sense, getting ready for war. Not that it is seeking to have a war, it feels that it is actually having to prepare for a war. And if you take hybrid warfare, some argue the war has already begun, taking all the digital and algorithmic cyber dimensions of that. It is quite remarkable how in just a couple of years, a region of the world that we did not really associate with a risk of returning to maybe not a world war, but certainly a globally relevant conflict getting out of hand, becoming very real in terms of imagining it at least. But let us be honest, much of what we also heard yesterday in the State of the Union speech from President Trump was a stark reminder that we really do live in a world that is ruptured, whether you want to use Mark Carney's narrative now, you want to use Chancellor Merz, or you want to take even the Munich Security Conference, which used the title of the international system essentially under destruction. That was the title of its paper. It always writes a paper for the moment in time. Clearly, we are in the midst of a process of rupture in which security has become, in some ways, the most potent currency. In a troubling way, by driving a deep sense of insecurity, through that insecurity dividing societies and dividing the world, and through that sense of insecurity and fear, increasingly legitimizing a response that runs counter to the very narrative that also security establishments, ministries of defense and think tanks and the MI5s and MI6s, the CIAs and FBIs and so on have been articulating over the last 10 to 15 years, that we are entering an era in which security needs to be rethought, reframed and reinterpreted. Now, what I've set out to do is to establish from a docking station at the Oxford Martin School in the University of Oxford, essentially a platform for the next 3 years to bring together a global consortium and interrogate how national security strategies are actually being implemented. The narrative, the prose, the intellectualism that runs through many of the national security strategies worldwide today is not the problem. Most of them acknowledge that we have a different set of risks, that we must work with different tools. But what is quite evident is that in the way that the current political leadership in many countries across the world is responding is essentially a regression back to a very narrow interpretation of security, of national security, which is the first point that I want to highlight. When I talk about security, and that is nothing new, but it is worth repeating, it is not the same as defense and military. We have to distinguish between a concept, paradigm, or doctrine of national security and what people traditionally associate with military and defense. They are not the same thing. And this is a very important departure point because, unfortunately, if you look at both the political and the practical and the budgetary implications of what is now happening worldwide, then you see that we are precisely returning to not only a massive increase in defense and deterrence, i.e. the military interpretation of how to make ourselves more secure. And the total military expenditure last year was roughly in the range of $2,700 billion, likely to rise to $3,000 billion in the next 2 to 3 years. And if we truly are going to see NATO countries investing 5% of their GDP, you can do the math. It's a $55 trillion economy that NATO countries represent. Imagine 5%, and interestingly enough, most people don't even realize that when we talk about 2 or 3% more, this is not, the current defense budget. It is 2 or 3% more of GNP, which could in some countries be another 5 to 10% of their entire public budget. These are massive expenditures. A country like Germany alone will spend in the next few years hundreds of billions of euros on military defense, in addition to its traditional budget. Now, the reason why I wanted to emphasize this difference between security and military is that I think it goes to the core of a debate that we now must take outside of essentially the elite circles in our societies, very often the intelligence committees, the military defense and think tank institutions, because their task is to see the threats that could possibly unfold. The question is, how does a society ultimately then decide and respond to these scenarios? Because they are, for the moment, scenarios. And what is very troubling is that in many of our countries, the public has disengaged from this discourse, even though the consequences of these decisions are directly measurable and translatable into reduced budgets for health services, social safety nets, dealing with climate change, the governance of AI, and the digital future that is unfolding. There's an immediate consequence to that, but these debates are really not happening because security becomes the overriding factor, and in that security discourse, investing in the military becomes the overarching and overriding driver. And what I envisage in this global effort of the platform that I would like to run just as a 3-year platform, because I think there are many institutions around the world examining, studying, thinking about security, is to first of all simply do an inquiry of how different societies are engaging around this notion of security. We can learn from one another. How Brazil thinks about security. And again, your national security documents and strategies and the updates also under this government, you cannot really fault them for having taken a systemic approach, having looked at transboundary issues, and yet, as Izabella said, perhaps sometimes in a context such as Brazil and South America, the transnational crime syndicates become as material a threat to national security as perhaps an imagined attack by an army from a neighboring state. And where I'm heading with this is that we really do have to embrace a new era of threats to national security. They are systemic, they're often invisible in the sense that they're not a tank or a drone or an aircraft that is flying towards your borders. The risks that we face today are, yes, in some instances still defined by territorial borders, but more often, and for most people in most countries around the world, in the year 2026, their greatest risk to national security is not their neighbor's army. And this is something that we do need to articulate because it becomes part of a foundation on which to think about whether it is naive, too idealistic, or just ridiculous to think that there is actually a majority of countries out there that sees in the way that it looks at its future security, an imperative in investing in the kinds of platforms, institutions, and architectures that allow cooperative international security responses to emerge. Just to give you 3 brief examples, they're all familiar to you, but they're worth reminding ourselves. If you take climate change today, and when I refer to systemic and invisible and transboundary nature of risks, these are the kinds of systemic risks that are not only a risk in themselves. We all know what climate change will cause in terms of its physical impact. We have learned a lot, including from the Pentagon 25 years ago, what the potential implications of this are for our economies, for our societies, for international relations. But we are still underestimating the systemic nature of these risks because we look at them in a sense, verticals. Climate change is not an isolated incident. It is a series of phenomena that immediately trigger and translate into other domains. Climate change is not so much the science of atmospheric studies, it is more the interpretation of how we will deal with the fallout from not acting on climate change. In that sense, I think climate change and the climate change agenda has actually outgrown the climate change movement, which is not a criticism of the movement, but it's more a reminder that the consequences that, if you look at them through the prism of national security today, are by far more significant in terms of their implications outside the immediate extreme weather events than perhaps we would have thought a few years ago. A second example that I want to link here is the emergence of digital platforms, the social media networks, the algorithmic security dimension of what is happening at almost breathtaking lightning speed in the world right now. The advent of AI, our inability to have even the most fundamental international agreements on how to govern this new economy, this new terrain, as you called it, was just illustrated yesterday evening again. Directly threatened by the Pentagon, Anthropic dropped its 2 precautionary clauses on how it would actually regulate its own development of AI. Because basically it got a 3-day deadline till Friday, unless you drop these governance restrictions that you imposed on yourself. Remarkably, this was a company that at least had put some in place. Unless you drop them, you will be excluded from any further future contracts by the US government, and you will be blacklisted. It took less than 48 hours for Anthropic to announce yesterday that it had dropped those. So we now have companies driven by a government in our international community literally being let loose without any regulatory boundaries or guardrails or even an understanding in our society of what it is that we are, in a sense, creating for ourselves. Now, the reason why I have made, alongside climate change, also the whole digital and algorithmic security a key vertical study part of this lab is that virtually every country is affected by this as well. And you may often also think that, well, you know, the Americas, the Singapores, the Brazils, they can protect themselves. No, they can't. Because the truth is we are so connected, so hyper-connected today, that countries in the Sahel that don't even have basic legislation governing the use of the internet, of digital technology, become the Achilles heel of an entire global network. The idea that you can turn off an entire grid in the United States or shut down hospitals or even undermine and perhaps sabotage a financial market and wipe out perhaps billions of financial records is not science fiction anymore. And it is the very illustration of why it doesn't mean if you are rich and technologically advanced, you can protect yourself only from within. And a third area that I want to just remind ourselves of is health security, biorisks, the next pandemic. The harsh truth, and I had difficulty believing that first when I was listening to a number of experts in Oxford recently, but it is something I've even heard now from the pandemic preparedness panel, is that the world is actually less well prepared for the next pandemic in the year 2026 than it was in 2018. How on earth is that possible? And again, a pandemic is not something that you can control with instruments and defense mechanisms only from within a country. The very lesson of COVID-19 was that our preparedness was so bad that we actually became a victim of a global pandemic because we had not listened to the advice, to all the expertise and all the mechanisms that we could have put in place. And even those may not have stopped COVID-19, but it certainly would have happened differently. I give you these three illustrations because they go to the core of what I believe is increasingly going wrong. We are investing in fighting wars of the future that may be wrong, that may be the wrong wars in which we're investing. Yes, if you're a Ukrainian today, there is not much debate that there is a territorial threat and that there is an army of your neighboring state that is invading you. My point is not to set up some artificial contradiction between a defense policy and an investment in your military capability. But when we are investing in extraordinary speed with extraordinary sums of money in defense and deterrence while actually defunding, deconstructing and destroying the architecture, the platforms and the means by which we can achieve cooperative security, which is essentially a paradigm that deserves more attention alongside the defense and deterrence paradigm, then we are in fact creating far greater vulnerabilities, and the vectors of insecurity, some of which I have just described, become literally not things of the future, they become material risks in the present. And I would like to end by just pointing to this moment in time where I think we do have to also pay a great deal more attention to how a society arrives at a point where it acts in ways that are seemingly irrational. But they are not irrational. They are by judgment deemed to be irrational, for example, on COVID. And how could it be that we are not investing in preparedness after the nightmare we just lived through? I mean, even the numbers, if you look at the numbers of people who died as a result of climate change already, or as a result of COVID, by far exceed the number of people killed in all the wars put together in the last 10 years. The economic damage of COVID-19. I mean, there is a asymmetry between how we are interpreting the significance of a certain kind of risk to national security right now, while actually ignoring, sidelining, or marginalizing the nature of risk that is as material, more systemic, and ultimately predicated on the ability of countries working together in order to mitigate them. How can we arrive at a point where that shared risk, a residual of a world that is, yes, very much divided at the moment, very stressed and very polarized, how do we get back to recognizing that we have a shared risk, a shared interest to mitigating those risks, that this requires international cooperation, that we cannot afford, excuse me, to simply dismantle the institutions, just like we cannot afford to just go on with them either, in order to retain the ability to deal with these 21st century risks that go to the core of national security, but not in the sense of pretending that we can become independent of the rest of the world. What we're living through right now, and I end on that as one way of reminding ourselves that these really are very extraordinary times. After probably 8 decades in which much of the international relations theory and policy and engagement, including of Brazil, really built on the notion of interdependence. We lived through decades in which we essentially created interdependencies, economically, politically, security-wise, culturally. We have just entered an age where there are very significant forces at play that are trying to essentially turn in the other direction. This notion of independence, of autonomy, of turning inwards rather than looking at how you can actually find common cause is therefore a profoundly different moment in modern history. And I think by looking through the lens of national security, of security and interconnected global risks, we may be able to rewrite a narrative that is fundamental to not simply drifting into a world that will go to war with itself. And I emphasize this because this is not inevitable. Nothing is inevitable right now. But the risk that this may happen is growing exponentially, literally by the day. And I think it is urgent that also in Brazil, and this is part of my reason for also being here with you today and spending the next few days in Brazil, to understand how in a political discourse and reflection in Brazil, a country that is not just a middle power, it is a major middle power. And it is in some respects a superpower regionally and even in some respects globally. How is Brazil thinking about this kind of systemic risk and its implications for national security, for how Brazil sees itself as part of South America, of the Americas, of the BRICS, or indeed as part of the United Nations, in seizing this moment not as one where you kind of sit back and watch with dismay, but we actually need countries to step forward. At the moment we have a phenomenal situation. We have a United Nations General Assembly in which one country has more or less succeeded in offending every other one of the 192 countries. And yet we are not seeing in any form or shape an ability for the rest of the world to say, America, that is your interest. It's your prerogative to choose your path. But this is not the age where one country dictates to 192 others what the future is going to look like. But we're not seeing that kind of momentum emerging yet, whether in Europe, whether in South America, or even in Asia. There are some individual countries who are able to articulate a more, let's say, robust strategy at the moment, but you can count them on one hand. The question is what happens next. Thank you so much. Thank you, Izabella.
Thank you very much, Steiner. I think that we have really good inputs for the debate. I'd like to invite now Maria Netto to add your comments and to provoke us. After you, I invite Lívia, sorry. Roberto, I'd like that you can wrap up everything and provoke all of us, okay? Because I know how provocative you are. So Maria, welcome. Thank you very much, Steiner. Thank you very much. And at the end, I think that we can have an open the floor and add some important comments.
Thank you, Achim. Very, very good points, actually. It was very, very actually good food for thought. Yesterday I was listening to a podcast, and they were precisely saying the first thing you were saying is, ironically, by focusing more and more in defense, we are becoming more insecure. So that's the first thing. No, we're investing more and more in security, but with this notion of defense. And by doing so, we're diverting resources from health, education, from inclusion, for productivity, for food, for many other things that actually would normally make us feel secure. And is a good point that I think over maybe not the last 80 years, but over the, let's say, at least 20, we had this notion that if we develop economically well, if we include people, if we have productivity, we will be more secure. We'll have better quality of life. People will be happy. They will have opportunity. Therefore, there will be less criminality. There would be less conflict. No? Maybe part of the problem is that we didn't achieve that. So I think one issue is also to think about how much inequality and the fact that the society is still very unequal. It led to this kind of radicalization. So that's one factor that I think we shouldn't forget, the economic development. And then I think the other points that you made that are important, just looking at the transversal risks, as you were mentioning. I'll come to climate because that's my area afterwards. But on the digital, I think beyond just the fact that is the immediate thing that indeed we start living in bubbles and the way we understand or perceive reality starts becoming very narrow. There are other issues that are major security issues that we don't even realize how much the digital actually brings us to, and having to consider how we manage this new tool is something that needs to be tackled with. In Brazil, for example, recently we had a major criminality case where fintechs were involved. And what people don't see, and I was talking to a friend from the financial system, from the Value Commission, and he was saying rightly so, when you have a scandal with a, let's say, transport sector issue is one problem. When you have a scandal with the financial system, it's actually the whole economy that flips. And so the risks associated to that are actually much higher than we think they are, because at one day to the other, we saw the crisis in 2008. One day to the other, this can be really disruptive. And if I read every day many newspapers, if you look at how the stock markets are dealing with AI, for instance, that's another issue that is quite concerning, because the stock markets are going up just for this, and then all the rest is going down. So how this impacts actually eventually, when I start seeing the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street is nervous about the AI share as well, and then suddenly things flopped out. And also how quick, as you were saying, every day this can become a major systemic crisis. And how we will handle that, because this is not something you can resolve in one place only. No? So actually, I think when we are talking about digitalization, AI, and so on, it's much more than just, it's about how we handle this new technology in our life, and is rethinking, is not just regulation. And it's important because it's, let's say, it has a lot of opportunities as well. Direct payments, we have Brazil Pix, and this has been huge because of digitalization. But we need to have tackle that, as you say, as a transboundary issue, because payments, because the system of digital in terms of finance, cryptocurrency, and so on, will not necessarily obey borders. And this needs a global conversation. Yet, I think the main issue that comes here is also precisely the reaction then coming still with the big tax on how I scale this, and then some countries, precisely on the threat and for many other reasons historically, using that as a basis for attacking. No? So relating to that, a big issue, I think, that comes with, for example, digitalization and the progress we have today, another risk that I see is transboundary, is the increased demand for resources. So if I see, of course, that, I need to increase AI and digitalization, and that's great, and it will deregulate, I still will need ships, I still will need metals, I will still need to produce those technologies. I will need data centers that will need a lot of energy. And where are these energy going to come from? What kind of resources I will use? And this is something I find is, from me, maybe one of the things that is the most threatening, because the conversation on natural resources and the boundaries we have on the resources is a very serious conversation that, if we don't have it very urgently, transboundarily, will not resolve it. We, as you say, we are not disconnected. If Brazil says today we'll just close the border, we are great because we have a lot of natural resources. We produce our own food, fuel, and so on. Next thing, Trump comes here and takes Lula instead of Maduro, because we are the second largest rare earth country in the world. So how much is going to be like this, or how much we are going to have a serious conversation on trade, on aggregated value, on global value chains, which is what we used to have 10 years ago. No? And that is where I think the question will start coming. I think where I find, for example, very concerning the Trump thing is actually that if I need more resources, I'll take up Greenland. If I need more resources, I'll take Venezuela. And it's okay. That's maybe what is becoming concerning, because if I need more resources, actually Trump understands very well there are transboundary issues. But from his point of view, there is no respect for as you said, the things we used to have at the very beginning of the UN, some minimum values, and how we deal with these values. So that's one point. And then on climate, I think that's a very good point on, because I was thinking about your platform, how we can bring in this platform the discussion about shared risks, right? On climate, we clearly is a typical global problem. I pollute here is going to impact there. We all know this, but how much evidence is needed for people every people to feel responsible and share responsibilities. I think this is a bit the challenge, and then I would say where we maybe failed as well, when I talk about we, like the philanthropies, the climate ecosystem, and so on. We were good to say we want to phase out fossil fuels and make some campaigns and so on, but the actual discussion on how every person really understands that this is a common problem and that we have to work together very pragmatically on thinking jointly on what are the things we need to do to move on, we were not effective. X did a survey for the COP30 with Ipsos in Brazil to see how many people or how the Brazilians understood climate change. It's very interesting because most of the Brazilians know what is climate change. They saw what happened in the south of Brazil and so on. But less than 30% felt that they were individually concerned or responsible, even to adapt. I'm not even talking about mitigating climate change. And that shows for me that if that doesn't happen at the level of persons, how can we make it happen at the level of countries? And I think this is a kind of a reshaping we need to think as well when we are talking about risks. But fundamentally, just to confirm, I think it's a great strategy, Achim, to start talking about security as a shared responsibility, because even in the strategy of defense, I can't increase my defense if I don't have access to resources of a third party. And I can't just expect that I'll go there and grab the stuff. Maybe that's what Trump thinks he's going to do in the short term, but that's probably what is going to end up having some kind of nuclear bomb, because you can't just expect that every country is going to be the same as Venezuela, and we saw how much it was a flop, the Greenland. So I think that's where the limit starts happening as well. There is no way, even if we were talking about defense making sense, that this will be able to be enhanced if there is no shared discussion on where the resources come from and how they are going to be addressed. And so I think that's a serious conversation. In terms of strategy, I think the only thing I would suggest on your platform is really think about this resource sharing, because food security, we're talking about health, but I think food security is also a big issue for many countries. In Africa, it's a big deal. I mean, I'm just coming from India. It is a big deal in India as well. And basically, as we start having this kind of competition for resources, the same, land that we use for, producing something may be used for something else. And so I think this whole discussion about the limit of the resources for the data centers, for producing weapons, for whatever is the development we are seeing in the future, we really need to start having a conversation on what are the boundaries and how we discuss about that, And so, since Clarissa is here, one point that recently I've been trying to discuss, maybe this is because we are Brazilians, we were in India, but we were discussing about biofuels in India. I found very interesting because you were saying that about 20% only of the population in India has actual access to transport. And so it was interesting because from their point of view, they were saying, if we want to enhance transport, we have 3 ways to reduce emissions: electric cars, biofuels, or biogas. Electric cars in India is coal, but anyway. Yeah. But I mean, the source of energy is coal, right? So the electric, I'm not so sure it's clean, it's less pollution, which is very important for them as well. But just to say, the ethanol, you have 100 million hectares of degraded land in India. You could talk about enhancing ethanol. In reality, if you have an increased need for energy, you probably will have pressure for fossil fuels, you have pressure for biofuels, and for renewables. How we are going to have a serious conversation about what is the share of those energies and how we address the need for more energy, and stop being so dogmatic, because in biofuels in Brazil, for instance, is not competing with food. And maybe in India could also not compete with food. And maybe more important for them in terms of access to transport than necessarily, I don't know, electric cars. So how we are going to start having a conversation also about this new spectrum of demand for resources and how we look at the resources available and technically and logically move ahead. I think part of the shared risks and the shared solutions, because I agree with you, this is all about the role of international cooperation. International cooperation started because of shared risks. How do we also rethink the international cooperation to be able to tackle these different views? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Maria. Thank you very much. I think that you're really provocative. I want to also explore the idea of perception, because the world that's also moved, consider perception, not the real world, the real things, and how security will come into this world of perception, how vulnerable indeed you are, okay, or not. Okay, this is very interesting when you go into the political perspectives and how countries like Brazil will understand or should understand its role or its relevance, consider the perception of the world. Okay, this is very fascinating because this is really different what you used to have when you go into international cooperation, and even considering the national, the mass issue, the relationship, the subnational, the federation, the federative relationship, the subnational players, how they understand their role. So you go into open things. Security is really an issue that allow us not to discuss things based on threats, okay, but be pragmatic enough to try things and not go into the debate about only the extreme events or the tragedies that, like Brazil, was exposed yesterday in Minas Gerais. Okay, so it's very interesting how you come to the rationality of the debate and you prepare for this and manage better the idea of perception. Perception is really the political asset today in the world. Okay, and I think that what's happening in the United States is very clear because nobody understands what's happening. But I'd like, before I come to you, if you agree, Roberto, to invite Lívia, because she's online. Lívia, you have the screen, okay? And I'd like to invite you to join us. I know that unfortunately you're not able to come to São Paulo to join us in Rio. But I'd like, in Lívia, it's really the new generation, it's part of the new generation. The one that I mentioned to you, one of them, that it's very important to come with the new generation, the Brazilian new generation, to understand the role and where we are. So welcome, okay, add your comments. And she's a post-PhD, okay, and it's very high-level expert in her area, and you're the director of Acknowledgement Instituto Arapyaú, and this philanthropy, that Brazilian philanthropy that's so important in Amazonia, in tropical forests, in Amazonia, in Atlantic forest. And so you have the screen, my dear friends, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Izabella. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Yes. And thank you also to CEBRI and Nix for having me and Arapyaú Institute joining this debate, of course. And thank you so much, Steiner, for this very inspiring framing. I guess it was about time that we have one academic organization, but also someone like you with your track record and mindset, putting together different pieces, different angles, but also different perspectives around such a contemporary topic. It is inspiring, but also very timely for us because, as you may know, security is leading our national elections in Brazil this year. So this topic will play a huge role in all the discussion about defense and so on. Military action is going to make a difference for us. I thought I could be more useful in this debate by bringing some Brazilian and also philanthropic flavor into it. So I take the freedom to jump into additional dimensions. One of them is how common goal-oriented organizations, such as philanthropic ones, but also think tanks and so on, contribute somehow to such a contemporary and urgent matter. And also, at the same time, how can we face the Amazon region as a very important landscape, so to say, for us to apply the ideas we are discussing today, and then you are leading at the Oxford University. But some words before beginning and jumping into those two topics. I think the central insight here is that security today is about managing interdependence. You were very clear about that. and the Amazon region maybe illustrates somehow the stakes. Either it can be framed as a defensive sovereignty problem or a strategic resilient asset. We know that if security is treated narrowly, it becomes a potential site of confrontation. And in a place such as the Amazon region, but also other parts in Brazil, we can see that really clear. But if we treat this topic systemically, of course, it becomes a potential platform for cooperative resilience. And again, that's why the Amazon region, perhaps Brazil as a whole, makes a huge difference in this debate. So from my perspective, the real question for countries like Brazil is how do we align climate ambition, economic strategy, but also territorial stability in a way that we can strengthen sovereignty while embracing all these interconnected dependencies that we have. And then, of course, what can be done to adapt the way we face security policies and structured nationally. So that's why I was so happy to hear from you that you are going to look at the Oxford University at how at national level we are going to see and analyze the implementation of national policies. And then again, for social organizations and philanthropies such as Instituto Arapyaú and many others here in Brazil and worldwide, I guess one of the major questions is, are we funding the institutional and cooperative architecture required for this systemic resilience? So I'm going to move on to the philanthropic aspect and then go back to the Amazon context. I guess it's really clear that there is a big and long road for us as a philanthropic field to put in place our strategies, considering risks in a systemic fashion, and to deliver strategies that go from threat response and resilience infrastructure. We have some ways to do that when we are testing them somehow, and ICS is also a good partner of thinking about how can we overcome those challenges. But for some of us, they are working on territorial development, but also looking at the global context. This means asking, are we adopting the right risk indicators to monitor the risks that people are going through? Which communities are more exposed to criminal infiltration? How do supply chains intersect with logistical corridors controlled by illegal actors? And this means bringing forest-based economies also in this dialogue. And how can cities, of course, and states, governments strengthen education, health, and service delivery as a whole to reduce some of the vulnerabilities that we have in these territories? Secondly, I guess philanthropies can support cooperation as risk mitigation, as systemic risks such as climate shocks and pandemics do not respect borders, as we all know, of course. I guess we have some homework ahead of us as philanthropic, but also social organizations as a whole. We could support transnational policy networks, enable global South leadership in climate security debates. We can bridge better academia, local actors, policymakers, and then, of course, doing all that, connecting territorial realities with high-level strategic discussions. So from my point of view and from what I learned from you, from your latest interviews, security must become a democratic and inclusive project. This is really key for institutions such as ours here in Brazil. And then again, we can turn to a region that is both unique and specific, but it's global at the same time as the Amazon region. And the matter could be, how do we tackle the very concrete entanglement or intertwine of development and security dilemma or issues through the Amazon region, perhaps as a laboratory of systemic security? That's what we have been discussing at least for 2 years in a network that we lead here in Brazil. So if today defining security challenge is the convergence of climate, technology, health, geopolitics, the Brazilian Amazon embodies the convergence of many of these aspects, as it is a sovereign Brazilian territory, a global climate regulator, a biodiversity reservoir, a frontier of critical minerals and natural resources, a logistical corridor increasingly penetrated and infiltrated by organized crime, in a region where institutional fragility intersects with global supply chain. So sorry for the multi-level thought here, but my point is, at the local level, the development security dilemma is really critical. So Izabella, just to sum up, when we come up to the issue of how sovereignty is exercised in a context of ecological interdependence, of course, we can see this very process of triggering systemic cascades involving deforestation, social conflicts, institutional erosion, cross-border criminal flows, and so on. And then, of course, the territories themselves will suffer for many of these processes and ongoing process that touch on people's lives. Thank you so much again, Izabella. We'll stop here so we can continue the debate and also listen to others' questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lívia, for your comments and also your provocation. I understand when you bring Amazonia into the context, it's so unique. Okay, the complexity of Amazonia is not only Amazonia, the complexity of the tropical forests, when in the basins, when you go to Congo Basin or go to Mekong Basin, okay, and you understand when you go to discuss tropical forests and biodiversity and nature, but this is the new axis in the world of the critical minerals, okay, and people, and you go into geopolitics debate and also energy security and also security as we're coming, we need to merge, we need to understand how the countries or the decision makers or the powerful men and business also will frame this. And we are coming to discuss this as, for example, in COP30, what's happening here, to bring TFFF as a fund, etc., but you're not running for the money of mining industry or AI industry to finance the conservation of the forest. And so we expose twice, 3 times, the vulnerability of these regions because we're not able to frame things and to bring another adult into the room to discuss, indeed, what it means for security. So we need to be disruptive to understand that what we have today is not enough to tackle the problems that are. Unfortunately, I'd love to have this idea that the last 40 years will so well succeed that will end deforestation in the Amazon region. But we still run behind. I'm sorry, okay? The only decision that we have in this country to address climate change in the last 40 years was to tackle deforestation. We were together in this. Okay? If we have renewable energy in our energy mix, not based because of climate change. If we had food security agriculture in Brazil, it's not because of climate change. Okay? The Plano Real was not the decision to have the stability of our currency, it's not because of climate change. Okay, the renewable energy mix that we have today in Brazil the decision was not based because of climate change. So when you come to discuss, as you're provoking us, that one of the pillars of this, to discuss security, this is also climate change and how it's important to come together to be less vulnerable. Okay, the decisions in this country, not necessarily, well, it was taken in the past to address climate change. Okay, including security in the Amazon region. The another thing that's very important to be observed is not, I'm not going to discuss Venezuela, but when you go to Amazon region, Brazil doesn't have a national concept on Amazon protection, on a national concept. We have an international one about climate security, about the importance of traditional communities, etc. Together, PPG7, we were together in this, okay? 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And indeed, when you come with security, as Lívia explored here, I understand this very well, how she's coming to show the overlapping of issues, because this is based on the reality of people. People are vulnerable today. We need to understand this. When you have the indigenous people, the new generation indigenous people, they move from the indigenous area, the territories, to the cities, to peri-urban areas, how vulnerable the new generations are because they're exposed to the organized crime in the cities in the Amazon region. It's not only the territories. It's there. Check what's happening in the new generation. So we need to have the audacity to take the right photos about Brazil. Oi, Pio. Welcome. This is Pio Borges, the head of CEBRI. They finally is contaminate for security and defense. So, hi, Philip, sit here, please. It's easy. All our friends, okay? The mafia is here, okay? Now, I mentioned cities, so the guy came, okay? And but I'd like to have you, my dear friend. Really, Roberto is so provocative. I like too much. We used to drink good wines, smoke cigars, and fight a lot, okay? But it's very good, no? And he cook a lot. Roberto, please, we have really different perspective here when it comes to discuss defense and security, the new ways to approach, and Achim provoked us a lot. Would you please join us and try to, because we discussed this 2 weeks ago, a meeting here, exactly defense and security, democracy, have different ways to come on this. And Brazil is an important country. If you are able to frame, okay, probably we will influence this. I'm not sure if influence nationally, not internationally. The relevance of Brazil, the international relevance of Brazil must be exposed for a really robust debate, in my understanding, okay? So let's understand what you have today in our hands, and let's provoke if some issues here really are important for us or not, or how indeed Brazil should join this international debate about defense and security, and our shared responsibility to drive really a new way to come together.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. I understand they're going to fly.
Yeah,
okay,
but that's fine.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Achim. I think it was a very, well, let's say, thought-provoking, but essentially sobering and very grim assessment of reality, which is only becoming because it's a really grim situation. I think the additions that were made by both other speakers, Maria and, Lívia, were very important as well. And I think I would only add to the grimness of the situation, because I think one of the central issues that is required to deal with this matter is governance. And we are facing a complete crisis in global, and not just global, and sometimes in national governance levels as well, in tackling these issues. And I would suggest that a lot of that is accentuated in democracies, where there seems to be a distance between what democracy is as a goal, as an end, and as a means. And this has made the issue more complicated in places where we used to rely very much on rational decision-making, and I'm talking essentially about Europe, and of course the United States. And Trump is a little terrifying, but perhaps more terrifying is that he was elected and re-elected. And this, of course, brings about the same issue. I think that what you suggested about the real elements of security is really not up to discussion. I think you touched it very well. You can add a number of elements, especially in Latin America, as you said. Organized crime is the biggest threat for security in Latin America. Not so much in other parts of the world, but here certainly. But the other three issues, the technological dimension, the health dimension, and the climate dimension, are obviously very, very crucial. You also referred, and I think another issue which was brought by Lívia, which is sovereignty. Sovereignty is the basic source of concern for security traditionally. And again, in this sense, concerns about security have a regional basis. You know, they say that all politics is local, all security is regional. And the concerns derive from that. And so, again, as I was talking to you a little earlier, Europe was caught by surprise by the new changes in the United States. Not so much Latin America, because we're used to dealing with this dimension that the United States has brought. In fact, I was talking to many Mexican friends of mine. I think Mexico-American relation is essentially what Mexico is reaping from the benefit of being a neighbor and the price it pays for being a neighbor. And it varies very much. For the first 100 years of Mexico, they paid a huge price of being the neighbor of the United States. The next 50, they're reaping benefits. And now, I don't know, let's leave it open. But it's a complicated matter. Anyway, I think that what you suggested is the only rational way to move forward. But are we going to be able to do it? Do we have the governance means locally, globally, to deal with that? We always thought that in spite of the permanent gaps in the legislation itself, but also in the behavior of the main actors, multilateral basis was a big, let's say, emphasis for support and for credibility in dealing with these global issues. But the most important, the most relevant, the most powerful, and the most referentiated country is leaving that behind. And it leaves that behind, and it leaves also an aspiration in many parts of the world, including Europe, of having little minions that would benefit from drawing closer instead of trying to fight or to arrange for a closer cooperation that could be developed. We were posed with my assessment, I think everybody else's assessment, a very interesting proposition by the Prime Minister of Canada in Davos. And you are basically picking up some of that. We have to have a coalition of interested parties dealing with these issues. I think this is rationally the only way to go. You very clearly stated that how to deal with that is always a controversial issue. I am reminded of an idea that was brought in Brazil, and we're talking with Aspasia here present about this issue. It's very difficult when you try to solve something on how to deal with that, but it's much more easy or much easier when you say, where do we want to go? And if you have a common sense of where you want to go, you can establish rational stages of how to get there. And I think this is one of the processes that has to be arranged. But of course, we would need to have, let's say, more reliability on governance, both at the global level and at the national level. And I see that democracy is becoming more dysfunctional in many parts of the world. And in fact, my own personal assessment, I don't want to believe that this is everybody else's assessment, the most rational international behavior today is exhibited by an autocratic country, which is China. Other democratic countries are having problems dealing with this issue. And again, you said, and everybody else agreed, and I do too, that security expenditure in military is inviting trouble. People like to use what they buy and the expenditure. And Europe's direction in this, of course, again, is a very regional thing. If you are in the Baltic or in Eastern Europe or in Central Asia, Russia is a major concern. If you are in Southeast Asia, it's China. If you're in Latin America, it's another one. We have not been dealing with this adequately, even in terms of defense in the case of Latin America. And again, it's a challenge that we will have to look forward to. And I think recent events, both internal politics in Brazil related to the military and external issues, are going to accelerate the need for a very serious consideration of this issue in Brazil. But because I don't want to take up much time, I think that Brazil is a country that is going to be continuously committed to finding the multilateral path. We have had much more success in dealing with that than in any other path. In terms of our diplomatic history, we are much outweighed our bilateral capacity in our multilateral fora. Even in the commercial fora, where Brazil, in spite of being a relatively large economy, is a very small trader. But in WTO and before that in GATT, we used to be a relevant actor in this fora. And I think this is not going to change. So I think many other countries see it that way. But I think the dynamics are going to be extraordinarily complicated. And many of the items that were mentioned, I would just reinforce, for instance, social media. I've been saying this for the past 10 years, is the empowerment of ignorance, and it brings about not just, and I would say, it brings about alternative realities, not just an escape from reality. It brings about alternative realities, which are even more complicated. And we see this in a pattern of vote in Europe and in other countries as well. And so, and this is something complicated to deal with. And I think that, but again, I think that the only format in which we can do, which can proceed, is the one that you laid out. But the challenges, because you have to incorporate the governance challenge. And how are we going to change this capacity? It's not simple at all. It's not simple at all. I do believe, as Lívia has said, in the power of civil society and other institutions to contribute. I think that what Maria pointed out in terms of the resources is inescapable. And I will also add a different dimension, which is population, you know. I always say this in Europe to make an impression. If Brazil had the demographic density of Germany, we would have over 2 billion people here in Brazil. If we had English demographic density, almost 4 billion. And of course, Europe does not really take that into account. And the need for resources, comparatively speaking, to live as they do in relation to that. And is this going to bring back the Club of Rome and issues of that nature? And of course, this is in relation to energy, the demand has been growing much larger than that, exponentially growing. And so again, it's another question that has to be dealt with. But I think what you're suggesting is the only path to go, and I think you will find that many interested parties, both at the national sovereign level and individual relevant actors, are willing to take up the proposition that you put forward.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I think that we have really good points and different perspectives here. Of course, this is why we're in Brazil, and why you are Brazilian. And I understand also, Roberto, very nice that you bring the issue of governance that used to come together with politics if you want to drive long-term problems. Okay, and this is part of this equation that we have today in the world. I would like to suggest, Achim, if you would like to add some comments, consider our panelists, okay? And after this, I will open the floor, okay, for the people that are here, to add 2 or 3 questions, if you allow with me, because I have to end by 5, okay? And you close the session with Achim, Maria, Roberto, and Lívia, if you do want to add some final comments. Do you agree? Are you comfortable with this? So I'd like to say that you have 10 minutes, okay, to comment everything, to provoke people. And I invite people to add 2 or 3 questions. And I know that you have for internet. Okay, and after this, I invite all of you to the closing remarks. As you say in Brazil, the fechadura. Yeah? Thank you.
Muito obrigado. First of all, thank you. It's precisely what you just said, Izabella. Whenever I come to Brazil, whenever I have the privilege to also spend time with people such as yourselves, I get enthusiastic, because I think the capacity in Brazil to conduct an intellectually honest discourse and debate is greater than in many other countries right now. Now, that is not to make you all feel better, but it is genuinely a feedback that I would like to give to you, which is combined immediately with a little note. Why is it then that Brazil is so inaudible on the global stage in terms of the sophistication with which it can transact debates domestically? Now, I add a second note to it. It is not a criticism, because in fact Brazil, in the last couple of years, has taken major initiatives with its G20 presidency, BRICS and COP30 to actually offer leadership to the world. In more than just a national interest point of view, I think Brazil deserves a lot of credit. President Lula, the whole team in different ministries, in Itamaraty and other places, but also in civil society, in creating, if you want, a commitment to doing more than just looking after oneself. Now, just like in the G20 presidents of Indonesia, of India, of Brazil, and now South Africa with even more scars, many in retrospect ask, why was it so difficult? Why did we not have more of an impact? And I think it is just an illustration of quite how complicated and messy international relations have become. But my appeal is, the worst possible conclusion would be, oh, it's pointless, we will just withdraw. This is a moment where, you know, in a sense, history is written with a future tense. And I go back to this moment when, in 1941, 42, 43, amongst you probably there are historians of multilateralism, there was a group of delusional people who actually designed the United Nations in the middle of the Second World War. And just to have the imagination, never mind the audacity, and if you want, the naivety of then going to Churchill and others and saying, oh, I have a plan for world peace. But it is the difference between becoming a passive observer or putting yourself forward. I have chosen in a very small way to try and bring that which I can bring to an international partnership. And let me also emphasize, while I'm very privileged to have been offered this attachment in Oxford as a senior fellow, I want to emphasize the lab is not an Oxford University project. Deliberately so. I mean, the university is very happy and is fully supportive of it, but I want to emphasize that the lab that I'm setting up is deliberately global. Its whole DNA is premised on different geopolitical and geographic interests. And in everything it will do, it is not associated with a European or a British or an American or a Brazilian or whatever security agenda. It is, in fact, a temporary platform on which the world can learn collectively from its very particular experiences around national security. And through that come to something that I think it was Lívia also who emphasized this. I do actually genuinely believe that the way forward, and I think in some ways we share perhaps that sentiment, although it may sound too simplistic, if we don't democratize security, we will end up in the Cold War scenario room and ultimately in the warriors scenario room. Because there is enough to disagree on, there is enough to be afraid of, and everybody is increasing their military budgets to the point where they genuinely do become a threat by their very existence. So it is a spiral, but I think, Roberto, what I would perhaps add in looking at this with a certain grim perspective, my real message is nothing is inevitable about this. The history of wars and conflicts is missing the opportunity when you could have done something about it. This is the tragedy of the history of war. And I think we are in a moment in time where the world has very much the ability to rewrite history in the future tense, but not by allowing the current forces to simply unfold, because they are very powerful and they build on very perception, being the word here, realities that people have either manufactured or have been communicated with or sense. And I don't want to be the judge of it. So, two messages. First of all, Oxford, please take it as a docking station, but it is very much a platform to bring together a global conversation without any one perspective, writing, so to speak, the first chapter already. I want to pick up on something, Maria, you said. First of all, inequality, absolutely. I've struggled whether I should make it an explicit part or not. It is, in a sense, underpinning so much of the tensions that are there. But it is perhaps the one area where I would say perhaps 60% of addressing this really is genuinely domestic policy choices, and 40% is related to interest rate hikes in another part of the world driving your debt expenditure up and therefore indebting your economy, essentially leading to what we now see, where in Africa many countries are now spending more on servicing their debt, as you know, than on their health or education budget. So I completely acknowledge it, just like you mentioned also food security and food systems, absolutely. I wanted to pick three exemplary ones. One could replace each one of them with another vertical. The three I mentioned are perhaps the most obvious ones where most countries could at least identify themselves with as having an immediate interest, but food security, food systems equally so, and many others. Lívia, I found, well, first of all, let me say thank you for bringing that philanthropic self-reflection. In fact, Maria and I were at a workshop in London last July, which left me a little bit perplexed because it was basically so big foundations convening a development corporation constituency and debating with a few representatives from the world that is often the target of development cooperation, how to deal with the crisis of development finance development cooperation. It was a remarkably diffuse conversation, not to say at moments quite confused, yes, but important and valuable because it shows that we are at a loss of what to do next and how to do it together. This is the biggest problem, because even the philanthropic sector is now under assault in the United States. It is also being scrutinized in other parts of the world. We are used to that. Even in the world's largest democracy, in India, it is sometimes difficult to be a non-profit organization. In Europe, in part. Remember, you now get arrested in London for belonging to, as a pensioner, to a Palestinian support organization because it has been deemed a terrorist organization. And I don't do this with any value judgment. I'm only saying we are seeing a remarkable backlash, so to speak, against some of the organized parts of civil society. So there is an urgent need to reflect on that. I think you picked up on something, Lívia, that I also want to emphasize. Much of what I'm, in a sense, proposing this platform can bring out more clearly is how do we manage interdependence? It's very easy today with all the pundits writing in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the Folio, or whatever, the Zeit and the Indian Times, that we live in a multipolar world, a world of polycrisis, multi-sphere influences, and so on. Is it a G2 world, or a G3, or a G4 world? At the end of the day, I think what we are, in a sense, confronted with is how do we manage interdependence in the 21st century? Yes, we are living through an extreme moment of political fragmentation, but I would argue it is delusional to pretend that that is reflected in the economic dimension of interdependence. In fact, we are more interdependent today than at any point in modern history. I think that's probably a fair way of putting it, leaves it open when that began, but I'll put it forward because you could argue in colonial times there was an extraordinary dependence of the UK on, you know, the resource supplies from the colonies, but let's take it as a global economy. There is no moment in history that I can think of where we have been more interdependent. Then on top of that, with the digital internet, AI, cryptocurrency, and I could go on, universe, and behind that quantum computing as another massive accelerator, the next 10 years will rewrite the way we actually trade with one another, exchange information with one another, are aware of one another even, and how we invest in one another. And this is unprecedented in human history. So to anyone who at the moment essentially advocates this agenda of building walls and retreating behind them and making military defense the security strategy is completely misreading the drivers of development, of access to technology, to finance, to food security for that matter. So, Lívia, I just want to emphasize I have a very strong focus on understanding not the abstract appeal to how do we manage interdependence, how do we create a narrative around that that becomes politically viable. Our politicians are scared of talking to their public about these interdependencies. It's much better to declare the neighbor from whom you buy your food a potential enemy than a country or a partner on whom we have to rely and therefore have to build relationships with, include with the shared security. Lívia, you also made a reference to institutional architecture. How are we funding as philanthropists that evolving institutional architecture? I would strongly urge you to pursue that question because I think here philanthropy has the freedom to test and invest in startup ideas that systems, public systems, really are not capable of or very rarely do so. It's easier to think in technology and research and STEM context about how governments can trigger innovation and catalytic investments, but when it comes to these sorts of questions, I think philanthropy has an enormously important role to play. And Roberto, I just want to echo your emphasis on governance. I think we are facing a 21st century governance crisis. Now, you know, once one calls it a crisis, do you sit back and watch it unfold, or is it actually an invitation to lean forward and see what we do about it? And this is where I want to close the circle a little bit to, I think, Brazil again, and how certain countries simply have a greater propensity, capacity, competence, credibility. You can put a bucket of different lenses with which a country like Brazil will be seen to be taking a, I hesitate to call it a leadership role, but a convening role. I've spent the last 8 years in New York, and that's why I want to contrast a little bit Brazil in the last 2-3 years in terms of G20, BRICS, and COP30, and Brazil's visibility and audibility, not because of its people in New York who are wonderful friends, but because there was, as with so many other countries, almost no confidence in investing political capital in New York, in a General Assembly hall, in the committees. And actually these are means to an end, ultimately in building a shared sense of purpose on how to deal with this unfolding crisis. We can get exhausted about Trump too. The fact of the matter is he is as much cause as he is symptom, and much of what we are today witnessing began many years ago. How do we respond to that? Governance is not some magic formula that you can simply apply to a society. Governance comes out of debate, discourse, provocations, as you often say, Izabella, but ultimately also out of a, first of all, shared sense of the direction of the future, and secondly, a basic minimum trust in the institutions that can transact that consensus, and those are our public institutions of government, whether it's the parliament, the judiciary, or the executive. And here we come back to where I want to end my brief remarks. Democratizing security means not going and delivering smart policy papers to elites, but helping to rebuild the confidence in the public to exercise their agency in actually being part of deciding the future of security strategies. Politicians ultimately act because they believe they can win an election with certain things. Just like a CEO will not do something that will get the shareholders to fire him or her. I think unless we can recreate in our democratic discourse amongst the public the sense of collective intelligence that is applied to this rather than just artificial intelligence, we will not be able to slow down this current momentum that is leading the world towards more and more competition, conflict, confrontation, and escalation. That is not to argue that the public will always be right, the public is always the best, but in this confidence, crisis of confidence in government, in international institutions, in the rest of the world for my future, I think it is essential that whatever we do, we put the public at the center of our attention. Without that, I don't think we will be able to, with smart, clever, intelligent analysis, change the course of history. And I really do mean it. I think there is nothing inevitable about what will happen in the next 5 years, but there is equally an inevitability if people do not step up, including countries, and in a sense, very rapidly so. Europe being another region, and you mentioned China. I did not have time, but I just make one reference. One of my, let's say, more hopeful assumptions about why we have very concrete possibilities of finding that shared interest is that basically the second and soon largest economy in the world has now bet its economic future on a green economy transformation. It can only succeed in doing so by being able to make the global marketplace an integral part of that transformation. So suddenly, to your point, Izabella, what began as a climate change problem-solving strategy, how do we reduce carbon dioxide emissions, ppm, etc., is essentially evolved into an economic opportunity. Just like China's electric vehicle strategy of the last 20 years began not as an environmentally driven issue. It was actually, as some of you will know who were part of it, an integral part of China's strategic thinking about what accession to the WTO would mean. Opening its markets, the first thing that would come would be vehicles. Chinese middle-class consumers wanted vehicles. China has now oil and gas and fossil fuels to power that kind of mobility platform. Therefore, a massive program was developed, and remarkably, with many other policy elements, has enabled it in 20 years to be essentially one of the front-leading producers of a whole new technology platform. And I think we need to look for those examples. Sometimes you may say, well, this is not my favorite country. Well, tough luck. They're there. They happen to be 1.4 billion, and they are not irrelevant to what happens next to Brazil. And I think it is a time for pragmatism and for looking for shared interests from which we can build the markets, but also rebuild the institutions for a more collective approach to security that ultimately is measured by resilience rather than by independence. And here I just end on the term sovereignty. Sovereignty in the sense of a more resilient nation that is clear about its interests but also about its interdependence is a notion of sovereignty I fully buy into. An underlying assumption that sovereignty is about making ourselves more and more autonomous and independent of the other, I think is ultimately not going to work in our age. And so I think this notion of sovereignty is a very interesting one to interrogate. What does it really mean in terms of not just international relations, but economic dependencies and future development strategies? Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. It was very nice. Now I have to manage time. It's really hard task, but let's do. I think that I would like to highlight two things. First of all, we have the former ambassador of the European Union, Inácio Ibanez, here online in Brussels, asking to say hello for all friends here and very interested in our debate. Okay. Also, our friend Murilo Portugal, you welcome us, connected, and asking you, the Deputy Managing Director IMF, asking you about if there is any hope for devising an international strategy of movement for gradually reducing defense expenditures, as we have tried to do, for instance, with international strategies for reducing CO2 emissions. Okay, and Murilo is asking us if you are able to add some comments about this. I will open the floor. If you have any questions for the audience, please show your hand. Would you like to ask something? Aspasia? No, Aspasia, go outside. Okay. Please. Could you please, you have a microphone there or not? No, you need a mic because you have people on the internet. And after this, if you don't have any other questions, okay, I invite the panelists to add final comments and you, Achim, to end the session, okay? Please.
So, thank you for our talk, Steiner. Thank you for all the floor for your presentation. Was really insightful. My name is Rubens. I'm a researcher at the Brazilian Army Command and General Staff College in Brazil. And I do agree with you that the link between defense, security, and climate change is undeniable, because climate change is existential threat to humankind. However, that brings some concerns. For instance, if we start framing climate change as a security issue, there are some political consequences in the international level and in domestic level. So we are talking about democracy of security regime, right? So if we frame climate change as a security issue, we turn the Security Council as we bring legitimacy for the Security Council to debate climate change. If I'm one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, it's okay, right? But all the others, 190 countries, that's not the point, because we lose voice, we lose power to debate, right, in the international level if we frame climate change as a security issue. In the domestic level, I do agree with you when you say that when we say about securitization of climate change, it does not imply automatically bringing the military on. But empirically, that's very difficult to see, because when security issues comes, society claims for the military action. And if we are trying to employ the military for climate disasters, to combat the wildfires in Pantanal or in the Amazon rainforest, we're bringing other actors, including the military, to the table, because it's a package, right? If we bring them, they are going to shape the public policy on climate change as well. And that brings an actor that has very particular perspective on climate change to the table. So how can we deal with this kind of plurality when we are trying to advance on the climate debate? Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, please? No? Good. Okay, I invite, first of all, Roberto, would you please add your comments, Maria and Lívia, and finally you have Achim answer your question and also final comments, and I will end the session, okay? Thank you. Achim, you have 2 questions. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I'll just take a note from the question. I think that the whole issue is that security is not really a military issue. It's much broader than that. So because it's security, it's military. No, it's much broader than that. I think it's exactly the point that he tried to bring. There is a dimension that is being overblown that is strictly military or essentially military. And from witnessing many events along my diplomatic career, I can see that, contamination on a negative sense spreads much more quickly than on a positive sense. And this is true for military and especially for special security services. There's no moral limit for any special security service in the world because they are convinced that no other security service has any moral limit, and moral limit is a limitation or an ability to carry anything out. So I think we're trying to get away from this dynamic. I think that the proposal that is here is the only way forward. I think all the consideration, and I will go further, not just never has the world been more interconnected than yet, not just in River. I think this is very clearly the case. And we need to start actions such as those in order to convince. I am only a little concerned about the governance issue because I think this is a complicated factor in every country in the world. Every country in the world. And to bring this through is not something that is simple, but your way forward, I think, is the way to move. And of course, as I said, I think that Brazil historically and today presents a very clear facade in relation to this purpose, an intent and an ability to, I would say, because, is Brazil a superpower? Well, environmentally, yes, it is a superpower. But what we do have is a credibility in many different corners of the world and mobilizing. And this has been increased over the past many years, but not just recently. It's something that has developed since, I think, the 70s and the 60s, actually, and has been enhanced over the past 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Maria, please.
I will touch, I think, on you said on the narrative and perception, because I think the big change that we can and should do is precisely if we change the perception that the solutions need to be systemic and that the risks are shared, we are doing a big change in the fact. So to take a very simple example, the Amazon case we're taking here, you can say, okay, we have this problem of mining in this specific area and illegal business and so on. You will not be able to resolve this if we don't resolve the broader criminality issue in the whole area. Actually, I would say it's not even only in the Amazon. It's from the Amazon to Michoacán, because we're talking about drug dealing and so on and so forth. We'll not be able to resolve this there because we'll maybe take some people out of there, they'll go to the next place and they'll come back. So if we are able to change the local perception as well, that it is not just about a defense, I really need to look at that systemically, else it's not going to change, that would be a big way ahead. The difficulty is that this is more complex. It's not as easy for a politician to sell, and it's not a bullet solution. So I think that discussion about the perception and narrative, how we can start having evidence of this kind of discussion is very important. And then I would like to talk about the interdependence, because I actually think on the future and the way we look at the UN, because we're talking about the Security Council, but also other multilateral businesses, multilateral development banks and so on, this is really what we will need to start to have a conversation. I think there will be a lot of different new interdependencies. They are happening already. Brazil and India never had so much connection as they are having today. And this is because of Trump. And we just got last week an agreement on critical minerals between Modi and Lula. And they are actually much closer because of the tariffs. They decided to be more aligned. In the BRICS, I worked in the New Development Bank. They can't agree among themselves. But actually, maybe now we are starting having even China and India to start talking. They were not talking. So it is interesting because we may have new interdependencies. How we are going to be understanding these new interdependencies and the role of different players. And then indeed on the governance is also about what is the new governance that we will need to bring these interdependencies and the positive cases of things that show that it makes sense. we need to have an agreement on critical minerals because Brazil has it, India doesn't. Brazil benefits from this agreement. How do we are looking at that as an opportunity to share and have more common agreement? So I think this kind of things to explore the multilateralism through these new opportunities is going to be also a bit the challenge and the opportunity on the other hand. And I think this is what will provoke as well, or needs a serious conversation, is what is the adequate reforms we would need to have as well. We have been talking about UN reforms forever, but I think there is a serious conversation nowadays on these reforms, and that's the moment. That's the moment to have this.
Thank you very much. Lívia, please, you have the screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Izabella. For me, the critical point here is what you, Achim, mentioned. How can we create a narrative to convince governments? I think there are many players that must be in this room, such as researchers, think tanks, philanthropists, but I guess there is one missing player here in our debate, that is the private sector. They are going to be also in charge of rebuilding or updating, reshaping the discussion about security, because we know that they are not the only ones responsible for matching many of the policies that we have today regarding technology, AI, and so on, in the digital point of view, but they are also suffering the effects of this interdependence, and how territories are becoming much vulnerable to many of these aspects. So probably this could be a next debate, Izabella. How can we invite the private sector also to sum up in coming up with solutions? Thank you.
Hello. Here, Achim, if you want this mic, this one. Okay, you have the floor, and I will end after you, okay?
Yes, I know.
No,
1 minute.
I'm relaxed. No, relax. You have a flight.
No, I have said far more than I had intended to, and I hope you forgive me, because I have thoroughly enjoyed, first of all, our fellow panelists, but also having a chance to hopefully have some contacts with some of you in the future. I will. No,
you have. Don't you have London? Yeah. And you become a fellow here. You have the partnership with Oxford.
Yes, I'm a good fellow.
He wants to be part, to have the one room here, okay? Yes, I invite him.
Yes, I'm even willing to convert religiously right now. No, just to thank you. No, congratulations. What a fantastic home, and what a fantastic place also to give expression to some of the conversations that don't always start at summits. Ideas for summits start in rooms like this, and I think we have all learned that over time. Let me just pick up on your point, very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking points. I think the military as an accepted institution in our societies is less problematic when they become part of our capacity to respond to emergencies. So I would love to understand a bit more where you perhaps see the lines being crossed there. Obviously, if you then put them into crime-fighting mode, as you see at the moment in Washington, D.C. or some other cities in the U.S., you cross a line that society is struggling with. So I think these are two very different things. So on climate, I think, if anything, armies, military, defense personnel gain in admiration, respect, and endorsement by being part of that backbone of society, but being part of it. I'm a little bit unpopular sometimes with Itamaraty, because I have for a long time argued that issues such as climate change that are material to security do belong in the Security Council. I do, however, acknowledge that in the way that the Security Council then sometimes interprets its mandate to act on it is problematic. So let's fix that. But let's not continue, as I've done with some colleagues in Brazil and in Russia and other places over the years, engage in a kind of shadow debate about whether the risks we associate with climate change should be debated in a Security Council or not. I think we have passed that point, but we need to fix the Security Council, which goes back to your point and to Roberto's point about governance. Let's fix a dysfunctional governance architecture. This is an architectural moment. I would perhaps like to give you another analogy back to Lívia's points, but also Maria's. Why I believe sometimes you can really drive narratives from the public into the more formal institutions of government and international relations. Let me recall a couple of examples. The Brundtland Commission. Brundtland articulated the concept for sustainable development. Now, Brazil then hosted the famous Rio Summit, which was the first attempt to codify and also institutionally articulate a pathway forward. But the journey between where the core concept of sustainability as reflected in the Brundtland report were first formulated by scientists, then by development thinkers and philosophers and whatever, it took many years. And in fact, we are still trying to live up to the vision of Brundtland in the way that we have organized our international response to it. But I do think that sometimes you can change a narrative by tapping the right nerve at the right time. I don't live in the delusion that a lab by intention can do that, but I think it should aspire to do that. Because we live in such a disrupted time that if we can pull together a brilliant, legitimate, articulate, and credible group, why not imagine that we can change the way that security is debated worldwide, in countries and between countries? And others are Greta Thunberg. How is it possible in our time that a young girl, 14 years old, on a rainy step of a Stockholm, I don't know, was it Parliament or the mayor's office, with a handwritten poster of all things, not even a digital platform, managed to inspire millions of young people across the world in the course of a few months? We live in a world where, as I said at the beginning, young people can be inspired. I think we have to give our young people more credit for being open to it. We have to relearn how we communicate. I know, Roberto, what you said about the empowerment of ignorance being something we associate with digital and social platforms. But frankly, when billions of people operate on them, the people on those platforms are also the people who sit in this room here. And we have millions of allies who are waiting to not be told what to think. This is perhaps the difference between an old-style communications press release and this is how we think you should think. We have to engage them in order for them to engage the discourse around security. And then we have suddenly millions of people within literally hours able to transact a narrative, a discourse, or a debate in 190 countries. It is an extraordinary moment in which we can have global conversations there, but we have to fundamentally relearn how we engage civil society. And finally, on the point that Lívia made on the private sector, I just want to echo what Izabella said. One of the other tasks that I have accepted of taking on is to chair the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, not because I believe Germany needs to organize a conference to tell the rest of the world what to do. The agreement from the Chancellor downwards is this is a platform that Germany is investing in as one of the countries that has the commitment, capacity, and willingness to invest its political capital in convening the world on a conversation about how we think about sustainable development into the future. And therefore, it is an experiment. It's 2 years old. This year in June, it's the third one. We will have a very significant effort to have the private sector at the table, not as the countervailing force, but in the private sector we have everything from the billions of small-scale entrepreneurs to the multinationals. They can all take very different positions. Let's open the conversation, and in that spirit I hope that security will make its impact also on that kind of conversation. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Achim. Obrigada. Oh, I need to answer this.
Yes,
Murilo, Portugal. Your friend.
Amigo. How can I answer your question? Have we got the ability to think of a way in which, just like with CO2 reduction emissions through international negotiations, we can reduce defense expenditures? My very quick answer is we have plenty of examples in it. We have disarmament negotiations, disarmament agreements, START agreements. We actually have a long tradition of using the multilateral system to reduce defense expenditures by having mutually assured security drive this momentum rather than mutually assured destruction. So on that note, I would say, yes, if we rediscover multilateralism, it is perfectly possible to envisage once more a pathway to negotiating military expenditures down. Thank you.
Thank you again. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming, okay, to Brazil, to CEBRI. I'll see you tomorrow in Brasilia, okay, new emotions. But it's different, okay? But I'd like only to highlight the importance, not to meet you again, but for you to be here in CEBRI. and you in Oxford, understanding that we do have a huge opportunity together with philanthropy, our players, our friends, to have really this bilateral understanding or agreement or cooperation between CEBRI and Oxford University, you particularly. I will be together again. The world will change, okay? And but I think that really it's important because we are friends, and the friendship is critical if we want to change things, particularly in this moment of the world, but particularly in this moment of the lack of trust, and the perception is based on fake news, okay, and the triple political crisis that we have today in the world, the denialism, the populism, and the misinformation in the world. We need to really come together, trust ourselves, and be really, have the ambition, the audacity to provoke the world and make sure that we can change things. I do believe that we can do this together, and CEBRI is also your home here in Rio de Janeiro and in São Paulo, okay? And I promise you that all you have caipirinha. Thank you very much for all coming, okay? And I promise next time. Thank you.